So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker of this webinar series. I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Shauna Henley from the Maryland Food Safety Network. So Dr. Henley works in the Northern Maryland cluster of the University of Maryland Extension System, and she delivers programs on nutrition, food safety, and physical activity. Dr. Henley is involved with teaching food safety at various levels from farm to fork, from the FSMA produce safety rule and also the preventative controls for human foods rule. And she also does webinars and workshops teaching consumers safe food handling. So today she's going to talk to us about effective strategies for training workers. So Shauna, go ahead, take it away.
Great, thanks, Angela. So yeah, we're going to kick off the monthly webinar series about talking and giving tips on effective and efficient training for your farm workers. So as Angela mentioned, the Maryland Farm Food Safety Network is composed of folks across the state, and we can give you more contact information later if you have questions. As a quick refresher, you're aware of GAPS and the Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA. And FSMA, again, is going to be a federal mandate. There are 7 final rules. And for Maryland and the university, we focus on providing education around the produce safety rule, which doesn't have a written food safety plan. And the other rule that we focus on through the university is preventive controls for human food, which does have a food safety plan. So that part will vary. And then again, for GAP, it's going to be a voluntary audit where a written food safety plan is expected. So for today, we'll talk a little bit about the difference between food safety education versus food safety training. We'll also talk about creating an on-farm food safety culture, and then dive into some of the produce safety rules and how that relates to your training. So what we know in terms of education and training is that knowledge does not equal behavior change. And from that standpoint, education is really going to answer the why of a hazard being a risk on your farm, maybe why you need to wash your hands when you handle manure or animals or after coming off of lunch break, where training is really going to answer the how to do something that is job specific. So how to properly wash your hands and things of that nature. And the nice part is that with good education and worker training, you start to get into aspects of a food safety culture. And in a nutshell, food safety culture is going to be how you do things on your farm. One of the quotes that I really liked from the founder of Samuel Adams Brewery is, when people are operating in a safe way, they are usually operating more confidently and carefully, which means they're operating in a way that will improve quality and reduce waste. And those are good end goals, no matter what your business is. So putting safety and training and education at the forefront of your business, hopefully smooth operations and outputs will follow. So when we look at FSMA and the produce safety rule, it's under 21 CFR section 112. And under standards for the growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of produce for human consumption, we're really looking at personnel and supervisors, as well as your visitors, that come in contact with covered produce. So that could be tomatoes, spinach, cantaloupe, for example, as well as food contact surfaces. Now, depending on your operation, the size, the commodities, your growing season, you can really have a lot of flexibility in how you go about training your employees or your workers. And so the rule really does give you that sort of flexibility. One of the things to note is in the lower right-hand portion of the slides, I did try to refer back to what section in case you need to, or just interested to check out the rule in specifics. So So some of the basics in terms of worker training needs, it makes sense that you would train your workers upon hiring. Also, giving your workers a refresher in training at least once a year also makes sense. I think one of the things people will need to keep in mind that training is an ongoing piece. So you may need refreshers or pull an employee aside and give them a one-on-one in case they need extra support. Another thing to consider is what will worker training look like? You may need to change your style and approaches if you have employees that are younger, seasonal, or possibly non-English speaking. Part of the produce safety rule is to make sure that you provide training that is easily understood by your workers. So having trainings that are in their natural language, providing signage that's in their natural language can be helpful. One of the things to note is that we do have some training materials in Spanish that you can ask for from the Maryland Department of Agriculture. They can send you a USB and I think possibly a 3-ring binder. And we'll also talk about some of the other resources too that you can access from the Maryland Department of Agriculture's website. In terms of visitor training needs, visitor by the rules going to be defined as any person other than personnel who enters your covered farm with your permission. So at a basic minimal level, you want to make sure your visitors know where the toilets are, as well as where hand washing access is. And in some ways, you might want to think about if you have school groups come in, if you have gleaners, or people coming in to volunteer or pick their own produce, what kind of training will they need? And again, the produce safety rule is just looking at bare minimums. Some best practices on how to train workers and your visitors is to be specific, keeping it short and simple, and those nice bite-sized nuggets that they can quickly understand. Another thing too for your workers might be relating their tasks and their training to real life risks. So emphasis on topics and behaviors of greater risk that are known to increase the likelihood of foodborne illness. So for an example, we know people can transmit foodborne pathogens from animals to produce, in other ways. If you're sick, you might be handling produce during harvest that goes to market. So relating good hygiene practices and those sort of foodborne risks can be important so people really understand why hand washing or clean clothing is important to prevent foodborne illnesses with your market. Another thing too to think about is on the job training. Instead of having people sit in a break room, put in a video and consider that training, maybe it's more important if you're talking about hand washing to have a demonstration of hand washing in a mock situation. It doesn't have to be in the bathroom, but maybe you have a hand washing station out in the harvesting, packing areas, and you can take people there. So they're relating environments to when they might need to wash their hands. Another best practice is to include other senses in your training materials. So it's one thing to lecture about hand washing, but if you can get your workers to actually practice washing their hands and thinking through those kind of scenarios of when they want to wash their hands, it might sink in a little bit stronger that, oh, I'm finishing up lunch, I need to go wash my hands. Or I'm going out to the field to harvest squash, I need to wash my hands. So how can you relate those behaviors with other senses? You might find that it's more effective based on your farm size or just how your operation runs that you want to have more one-on-one trainings. And then again, respecting the values and diversity of your workers. We know people come from a lot of different backgrounds, So what you might perceive as a normal understanding, you might need to train people. And in general, it's your farm operation, so training people how to carry activities that you want to be done is going to be important. So for example, a lot of the GAP and FSMA trainings will provide posters on hand washing. And a lot of people know how to wash their hands. However, some people might not come from a home where learning how to wash your hands after handling food, after going to the bathroom was part of their normal routine. So just reiterating and understanding that people are going to have a different understanding is important. Another way to think about how you approach training with your workers is to review food hazards. In general, when you're looking at food, the 3 different categories of hazards fall under chemical, physical, and biological. So chemical could be something like sanitizers or disinfectant chemicals that you use on farm. Physical could be bits of plastic harvest bins that get into the cardboard boxes of leafy greens that go out to market accidentally, or rocks or anything else unintended. And biological relate to the bacteria, viruses, yeasts, molds, and those sort of pieces. So understanding what kind of food hazards you're looking for throughout your farm operation might help you prioritize what training needs to be done first. One of the things that we'll probably talk about later on throughout our monthly webinars is prioritizing hazards. So a simple thing here could be drawing a map of your whole environment of your farm, as well as drawing out a map of your packing shed, whether your packing area is outside or enclosed inside with 4 walls. At least then when you have pictures, you might be able to identify where they're more likely going to be a hazard occurring. So for some, if you're looking at the aerial picture of the farm, you might have animals. So you might want to think about how animals and manure could become a biological hazard to other environments of your farm. Or for your packing shed in this picture, in the lower left-hand corner, you see a brown grid, and you might think, okay, well, we knew that if we stacked tomatoes against the wall, that could be a hazard for animals because animals like to run next to walls. But if we give a little 6-inch space between those tomatoes and the wall, we know that animals have space to run next to the wall without getting into the tomatoes that are going to market. So these are different ways of thinking about hazard and trying to pinpoint what trainings related to these hazards might be more important to get to with your workers as things unfold. At a minimum, all personnel, visitors, and supervisors should understand the basic principles of food hygiene and food safety. So an example, having good judgment of what a foodborne illness or symptoms might look like, so you don't have workers or visitors coming in and picking or touching covered produce when they're sick and possibly spreading disease. Another basic principle is hand washing and some of the situations of when you would want to hand wash. So like before and after picking, after using the restroom, after coming in contact with livestock or animals or manure. And then also understanding having break areas to keep food and drinks separate from different areas of your farm operation. Again, records is going to be important, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But as part of the rule, it will be expected that there is training in relationship to the produce safety rule from subpart C to subpart O. For hand washing, as you can see here, you may not use antiseptic hand rubs as a substitute for soap and water. One of the videos I want to show you is something from Kansas State University's extension. It's called high-speed hand washing. So it might be a different technique or an approach that you can use at your farm operation.
Hey, Shauna,
Yeah.
we're unable to hear that audio, unfortunately.
So basically, the high-speed hand washing piece, even though it was used in an elementary school setting, it's been applied to farm workers. So over here on the right, you can see a poster of how high-speed hand washing works. And here they reference it too as part of COVID-19. So basically, you can keep all your workers 6 feet apart, have them rinse their hands, so wetting their hands, getting that soap or surfactant, scrubbing, and instead of having that one employee at the sink doing all the 6 steps of proper hand washing, you're having your employees rotate so that they can really get a good and proper lather. And you're not wasting time. So you're quickly or more efficiently using time to rotate through, but knowing your employees are getting that good 20 seconds of lathering. Another key thing when you are thinking about hand washing is possibly having signage, because there have been studies that have shown that having signage to remind people of hand washing help them remember, but also helps them to remember the right steps too. When you are thinking about hand washing stations, some of the basic requirements is to make sure you're scrubbing with soap or an improved surfactant, you have access to potable water, and you are thoroughly drying your hands. So the educational piece of why do you want to thoroughly wash or thoroughly dry your hands is because if your hands are slightly wet, they're more likely to cross-contaminate other surfaces. So making sure your employees know that their hands should be thoroughly dried to prevent cross-contamination can be important. So how you do create an area for hand washing is up to you. The more expensive route might be to build infrastructure where you have running water, electricity, and so forth. Another option too would be renting a hand washing unit, as well as what you see here in this picture from the University of Vermont. You can make your own hand washing station, making sure you have the basics of soap, potable water, a container for gray water, some sort of garbage can to throw that one-time use paper towel away. Another thing to note too is that when you do look into the rule, they say that you can dry your hands with a paper towel. You can dry your hands possibly with an electric hand dryer. So there are some other options for drying your hands. The only thing the rule does not mention, which you shouldn't use, is a cloth towel for hand drying, because those collect a lot of dirt, grime, and bacteria. Another important piece with training your employees is just knowing those hand washing situations. Some of the basics are before starting work, putting on gloves, after a break, after touching animals or handling waste, and any other situations where your hands may become contaminated So a picture here I have is using a cell phone. That could be one of those situations that if employees are using a cell phone or a tablet, you may want them to wash their hands afterwards. Because there are studies that show cell phones can be a tool to cause cross-contamination. If you use gloves, you might want to think about how you want your gloves to be used and what kind of protocols around gloves you want to establish. So you might have disposable gloves like you see in the picture with the blue gloves, or you might have gloves that are cloth or rubber or plastic. So how do you want employees and workers to handle those gloves? In general, pulling from ServSafe, which is more retail focused with food safety, you want to make sure that gloves are intact. So if you had a torn glove like you see in the picture, you would want your workers to change out their gloves. So throw that glove away, wash their hands, put on new gloves. You would want their employees to keep their gloves in a sanitary condition. So maybe if you have cloth ones, making sure they get washed on what you consider a regular cycle. If they got soiled, let's say the disposable glove on the left got grease on it, you might want employees to take that glove off, wash their hands, put on new gloves before they continue to harvest covered produce. You might even want to have time regimes where you have about 4 hours of continuous use on one task with gloves, and then after 4 hours, you have employees switch over to new gloves. So 4 hours of continuous use could be 4 hours straight of picking or harvesting produce, or maybe 4 hours of continuous packing if you're doing something in a packing shed, for example. You might want to establish standard operating procedures or SOPs as part of your training. So giving further guidance about when and how and why you want to use gloves in certain situations. And there are a lot of templates for SOPs. So for example, let's say you use gloves for harvesting tomatoes and squash. Basically why? You want to use gloves to prevent bruising of the tomatoes, or you want to use gloves to prevent workers from getting itchy from the little trichomes or hairs on squash leaves and vines. You would talk about the scope of the work, keeping it nice and simple, and the responsibility. This would be something that would be overseen by the supervisor, so making sure proper glove use during harvesting is happening. And the worker's skill level, it wouldn't matter. It should be applied to all worker skill level. Other parts of your SOPs would be procedure. You can write them out, you can have pictures, you can do a combination. It's up to you. And then you want to make sure that your SOPs are in good working order. So how are you going to verify that they're working as they should amongst your employees? Another kind of SOP is called your SSOPs, so Sanitation Standard Operating Procedures. Now, this could be something focused more on those cleaning and sanitizing routines. So things that would go into your SSOP would be when you would clean and sanitize, how often you would clean and sanitize, who is cleaning and sanitizing. And another thing here that could go into your training is making sure people understand, what level you're looking for. So if we look at the picture of the litmus paper, it's basically different colors related to pH, so acid and basic pieces. So if you were training your employees to take the pH of water to make sure you were making a good sanitizer, you might tell them that the litmus paper needs to be green. But if we're looking at the middle three litmus papers, they all look some sort of green. So understanding that your employees realize what color green you want them to look for this SSOP can be important. You also want to make sure that you have records on your workers and your visitors that are getting trained. You want to make sure that the activity that they're being trained on is being listed, as well as the location, their name, their signature, the time, as well as who's signing off that these people were properly trained. Again, there's a lot of templates for training records. You may want to refer to your CFR section to make sure whatever template you find online or whatever template you create yourself hits all those marks. With subpart O, records, you really want to make sure that the records that you keep are going to be accessible within 24 hours. And why the 24 hours? It's because if there was to be a foodborne outbreak and either the health department or FDA was involved, they would want to have your records to start looking through as a traceability piece within 24 hours. You also want to make sure your records are easy to read, as well as keeping your records at least 2 years past the date the record was created. And whether you keep your records as an original, copies, or electronic, it's really up to you. And some of that might be based on how you can keep your records, what's going to be easier. And some of that might be a little bit of trial and error. So getting feedback from your workers as part of your record keeping can be important. Another important piece of the produce safety rule is making sure your workers are getting specific training for certain tasks or specific tasks. So if your farm operation is one that has livestock, you might want to make sure there's specific training for any workers handling livestock, handling manure, and things of that nature. And we'll get into these 4 bullets. In terms of livestock and manure, you might want to do a risk assessment. Observe and talk to your workers to see how they handle livestock and manure. What kind of hand washing practices do they have? Do they have the right PPE? Do they have the right footwear hygiene? And also, are the feeding and water equipment and containers easily and frequently cleaned and sanitized? Ways that you can help train workers in these situations is to either role model safe practices when you are working with livestock and manure. You can also train people to do an activity and just have them teach it back to you to make sure they kind of understand it. And then role play. Give people certain situations and see how they react, or what kind of issues can you anticipate and how will they go about correcting this problem. Another area that you want to train your workers during harvest is around drop covered produce. So basically, drop covered produce is when something like a tomato or an apple, something that isn't grown in the ground or touching the ground, like a root vegetable or cantaloupe. So over on the left, we see a tomato that has fallen off its vine and touched the ground. We see apples that have fallen off the tree and touched the ground. You want to make sure your workers know not to pick those produce off the ground and put them in the harvest bin, because there's concern that there could be bruising and small cuts that could allow bacteria on the soil to go into the fruit of the tomato or apple. You also want to train your workers that if they are harvesting something like onions or carrots or cantaloupe that grow on or in the ground, that's part of that natural process. So they could continue to harvest those covered produce as is. When you're working with harvest containers and equipment, you want to make sure your workers know when a harvest bucket or container might have outlived its life. So having a plastic bucket with cracks or holes is something that you would want to discard, because a small crack would be hard to clean, it would be hard to sanitize, and could provide a perfect environment for bacteria to grow. You also might want to think of a way and work with your employees to figure out, how can we organize our tools and equipment so we know when they're cleaned, know when they're possibly sanitized, and people know where everything is easily and quickly. Another important thing with your worker training are corrective actions. So if you see something that's wrong, if your employees see something that they think might be wrong, you want to have an environment where they feel comfortable to go to the supervisor and say, I think I saw something that might be an issue, because the worst thing that can happen is a potential problem doesn't get communicated, and over time it becomes a larger food safety risk. If we're looking at this photo from the University of New Hampshire, we see a packing shed. Some of the things that if I was a worker, if I was a worker, I might tell my supervisor or manager in the packing shed, like, hey, that's great that in the far back left picture, we see that the cardboard is off the ground, but we see in the picture right behind the employee that there's cardboard boxes sitting right on the grounds. We need to get pallets or something to lift those cardboard boxes off the ground so we can clean. We don't have to worry about potential pests. We don't have to worry about something flooding and possibly soaking those cardboard boxes and making it become a food safety risk, or just molding out the peppers. Another thing here, if I was a worker, that I would tell my supervisor is, oh, those pallets in the far back corner are against the wall. We might want to pull them off the wall a little bit to reduce any issues with pests crawling into the cardboard boxes instead of around them. When you're working with your workers and personnel, you definitely want to make sure that you are clearly communicating the tasks that they're to perform during training. You want to be a good listener, because they might see something that you didn't see that could be a food safety risk. Having a good positive attitude and being a role model is definitely important when you're building your on-farm food safety culture. And a lot of that is going to be coming from a top-down approach. So good role modeling and a positive attitude can go far. And if there is an issue, trying to depersonalize it so your worker doesn't feel like it's themselves that's the issue. It's more of a problem with something else. So depersonalizing. And you want to give your employees a sense of responsibility, that they have skin in the game, and that they have a good open voice that you're going to be receptive to. So hopefully some of these training tips will be useful for your farm operation. Again, we're here to help and give maybe some tidbits and advice that we have to make your training more effective. We know that right now we have some posters and magnets that can help keep visitors aware of some of the basics in terms of sickness, hand washing, when they come into your covered operations. And I think another thing too is to remember, or just anticipate, that there's going to be retraining, and how that looks and feels like is up to you. And it could be employee specific. For resources, if you go to the Maryland Department of Ag, you'll have the main website, but over on that right-hand column, you'll see under training presentations, we do have some information in Spanish, as well as other resources from a national level, a state level, and a university reference. Our next seminar is going to be June 19th, focusing on water risk assessments. And please feel free to sign up the same way you did with this one. If you feel like providing a teaching evaluation, please feel free to check out the website. And then I will go back to the contact information form so folks can have that. So we can open it up with questions.
Great. Yeah. Thank you so much, Shauna, for a fabulous presentation. Speaking of evaluations, attendees, you're also going to be receiving a link at the conclusion of this webinar for a short eval on the web series. And it'd be very helpful to us if you can fill that out and you can give us a sense of how we're doing and how we can improve for the future installments of the webinar series. Shauna, are you okay with sharing this PowerPoint with participants?
Yeah, I'm fine with it. Mm-hmm.
Fabulous. So if anybody on the call here would like to get a copy of this presentation for later reference, just go ahead and email any one of us. I think Sarah Everhart's contact email is at the Eventbrite itself, so you can go ahead and email her and she can get you a copy of this PowerPoint. So with that, let's go ahead and open up the chat. I'll take any questions, or Shauna will take any questions you have.
And remember too, there's no wrong way of training. Some of the things I tried to share here were videos. There might be a case study to share. There might be mock situations that you can create to see if your workers can pick up on what might be a food safety risk. The goal is to really have them think and understand, like you, how to determine what a food safety risk might be and how to correct it and who to talk to when you think there is a food safety risk going on. So yeah, really no wrong way to train employees. It's going to be a little bit of your farm's food safety culture. So for your farm, it might be easier to train employees using video clips. For others, it might be a one-on-one situation, but hopefully we provided you with some tips and tricks to effectively train your workers. And you can make it fun.
I've got a question, Shauna.
Okay.
What would be your strategy for training if your workforce is mainly like groups of volunteers that come, and sometimes it's a different group of volunteers that come, and they come 4 or 5 times for harvesting? How would you strategize training around that?
So some of it could be understanding with your group of volunteers, what commodity are they handling? We've seen in the literature that certain commodities might be higher risk than others. So if that's the case, you might want to make sure hand washing is done effectively. Maybe you want your volunteers to wear gloves as an extra layer of quote unquote protection. Another thing too is maybe you chunk the training or the harvesting in smaller pieces in the beginning to make sure they have a good sense of what their expectations are coming onto your farm. And then as they kind of quote unquote gain trust in how everything should be running, you can extend those time periods without breaks and asking them to show you what they're doing, or in terms of a retraining situation. But again, it's really going to be a little bit of trial and error depending on who your volunteers are. If you have volunteers that come in that are more seasoned, more experienced with harvesting and farm life operations and that sort of culture, they might be coming in at a higher learning curve than a group of volunteers that might be a group of, I don't know, for example, students that don't have that sort of real on-farm experience. So how you go about training those two different groups of volunteers could be different. Role modeling and maybe some teach back opportunities in small groups might be effective depending on how much time you have with this group as well. But again, when you think about training, it doesn't need to be an hour session. It could be something as short as 3 to 5 minutes. Maybe you offer brief refreshers every time this volunteer group comes onto your farm.
Thank you. Yeah, I love that. That's a lot of good information. Any other questions from the chat? Oh, here we go. We've got one from Carol. Carol Allen asks, how often should you retrain?
Good question. So how often you should retrain? Maybe it's in the end, it's going to be up to you as the supervisor. So it could be something where you want to briefly retrain or just review a certain task that might be very job specific right before workers go out to harvest, go out to pack, whatever the task might be. Maybe you did a group training and everyone is just clicking and understanding what they need to do, but you have this one person that is kind of lagging behind. So you notice based on observation, they're just not hitting the mark of where they need to be. So you gently pull them aside and just briefly retrain them. And if you do something like that, you want to make sure you record that retraining for that individual. Everyone's going to learn at a different pace. Some people are going to have a stronger skill set too. So just being able to observe your workers, talk to them, and just know their strengths and weaknesses will definitely build that food safety culture. So you really are operating smoothly.
Great. Okay, we've got another question from Carol. So we'll take this question and one other question if we have one. But Carol's next question is, have you found mentoring to be effective, especially with new employees coming in mid-season?
So I can't say I've personally seen mentoring to be effective, but it could be a tool for some farm operations that they do find it effective. So maybe you have a more well-seasoned employee that takes on someone newer and shows them the ropes or gives them those extra tidbits of information to really bring them along to being part of that group. I would be curious though if anyone has done some sort of mentoring with their staff and employees that have improved their operational practices.
Yeah, I agree. That's a good idea indeed. So our last question comes from Andy, and he asks, do you recommend creating an SOP for every task an employee or volunteer would perform, or just the major tasks?
That's a good question. Again, it's probably going to be up to you. A way of thinking about creating an SOP could be prioritizing what would be the greater risk to causing a foodborne illness. Even so, SOPs are great to have on record I call it your Go Take a Vacation manual. Angela or Carol, I don't know if you have any inputs from what you've also seen in the field about SOPs.
Yeah, I can speak to it a little bit. What I would suggest and what we get people started with is exactly what you said, Shauna, getting people to kind of prioritize, well, what is the most important thing? And Carol says the more the merrier. That's definitely very true. But I like to start people off on what's the most important thing that's very detailed or that you need them to do exactly correctly. Do you need them to, is the way that you're stacking harvest bins and the way that you're organizing them inside versus outside on a pallet, is that really important and it needs an SOP, right? Maybe clean ones stay inside, dirty ones stay outside. Maybe that needs an SOP. Mixing sanitizer, that definitely needs an SOP, and monitoring sanitizer. Things like that. Okay, Carol has one last thing that she wanted to enter into the chat. Okay, great. Yeah, no problem, Andy. If you have any questions, as you're putting together your SOPs, feel free to reach out to us. We definitely, it's a big task to get all the components together for a food safety plan. So if you need a mentor or a shepherd to help you prioritize, we're definitely here for you. And then Carol's last little comment she has that we want to address is, where do you see employees falling down? Do you have to constantly retrain? Oh, was that, Carol, was that a response to where you should put SOPs? I think it might be. Yep. Yeah. And that's exactly right too. So after you've done your prioritizing and after you figure out which activities you definitely want an SOP for, if you're seeing that you constantly have to retrain somebody on like hand washing, maybe it's now time to put that in writing exactly what you want. So you set the expectation for people in writing. So it's easier for them to meet that expectation if you have something to refer to. And Carol also says more signage, which I definitely agree to as well.
Yeah, and another thing too with signage, you might want to think about switching it up from time to time so it doesn't become something on the wall that people know is there, but they don't really pay attention to over time. So changing up that hand washing reminder could be a good thing.
Yeah, definitely agree. All right. Well, thanks everyone for the really great chat that we had at the end of the session. And thank you, Shauna, for coming on and being our first presenter of this session. Guys, I look forward to seeing you again next month. We'll be talking about water. And until then, I hope everyone stays safe, healthy, and has a productive June. So with that, we'll end the session. Have a great weekend, everyone.